you kind of lost data transfer. I don't know what's going on.
FTP, file transfer protocol.
Now, what we have to remember is that not every position can be changed to every other position.
And making sure that the users we have now stay happy and stay on while trying to attract some other people to play.
It makes my home, but
yeah. No, that's over in a heartbeat. Ain't got any problem with that.
Welcome to another episode of This, That, and the Other. I'm your host, Magic. This is Season 4, Episode 17. And tonight we do have a couple guests that are supposed to come on with us and have a quick discussion about some experiments that they have either done or would like to see done in GD. It's been a pretty active discussion on the forums regarding some experimentation that's been done by coaches over the years. And I think Sir Biff is one who created that thread. And it had some pretty interesting comments, some ones that even made me kind of go, You know, Cat's Fang, for instance, that was the one that he mentioned. He doesn't, in this particular experiment, he didn't make it a habit of drafting quarterback or running backs and wide receivers. All he drafted were quarterbacks and tight ends. Basically, the tight ends filled in for the running backs and the wide receivers. And he ensured that he had a quarterback that was a running style quarterback, because the offensive formations he ran in that experiment were the Notre Dame box and shotgun. Now, he didn't go into detail if when he was running shotgun, if he did in fact throw the ball to the tight end / running back / wide receiver, or whichever one the tight ends were filling. With shotgun, of course, there's no running back, but you've got the 4 wide receiver positions. And with the Notre Dame box, I'm sure any passing that he did, as little as it possibly was, would have been to tight ends, of course, filling those positions. I think throwing to a tight end playing a running back position would probably be a little more successful than throwing in a shotgun to tight ends that are filling wide receiver positions, unless, of course, the draft or the recruiting, the recruiting was done in such a way that you specifically targeted, or he specifically targeted, tight ends that would make decent wide receivers. If that was the case, then I could see how that would work. But again, he didn't bring enough detail to the board to actually give us insight exactly how things worked out for him, or what he was able to determine based on his activities within that experiment. Not sure if that was because of a little bit of trade secrets that he didn't want to get out there to everybody, or he just didn't feel like expanding on his thoughts or his comments regarding that team's makeup. Not sure if he's coming on tonight or not, but it'd be interesting to hear how some of that worked out for him. He did make mention that the quarterback in that setup had the number 5 largest rushing total of all players in D1 that particular year. So that kind of leads me to believe that even in shotgun, he kind of stayed away from some of the passing and focused primarily on getting that running, or that quarterback some running opportunities, and basically just ran the ball. So again, he didn't elaborate. Did he have 2 or 3 quarterbacks that were able to fill in and do that duty, or did he just run this one quarterback to the ground, so to speak? Would really like to have a conversation with him to see how that evolved. Now, personal experience, what I have done is just goofing around, and gosh, it's been years ago, and I think it was a camp team or in the camp world that I specifically used for experimentation. One of the things I did is I didn't carry a kicker or a punter. Essentially, the quarterback came in and did those duties. And one of the things that I did intentionally in that experiment was I made sure that the quarterback that was starting was not the one coming in. So, the second string quarterback, if you will, was the one that was coming in and doing the kicking and punting duties. So I had my primary quarterback. His substitution rate was pretty low. That way I made sure he stayed in the game. Now, when it came to punting, I knew that my target was to get that second quarterback in the game to do that. And one of the things I wanted to make sure of was that his strength and his technique was really high in comparison to a typical quarterback position. Because I wanted, even though some of those core values were going to be downgraded because he was playing out of position, I wanted the best opportunity for him to have some success at kicking the ball. And overall, this was at D3. No, I'm sorry. This was at D1 AA, if I remember correctly. D1 AA. Pretty successful in regards to being able to make the short to medium range field goals. By that, I mean, about 35 yards and in, he was pretty reliable. Anything beyond that was just a roll of the dice. Punting wise, if I recall, he did get better throughout the season. So he was never a 45-yard average guy by any means, but he was high 30s, low 40s to that position based on him being a quarterback. It's not really that awful. Now, the concern is when you're playing in the competitive game with a really good coach against a really good team, you're really going to lose some opportunities to put points on the board when your kicker is not able to extend that field goal range opportunity for those 3-pointers here and there. And also, you do suffer in the fact that field position is going to be in favor of your opponent because, again, I mentioned he did not have a very good punting average. It was, doable, but not necessarily when the game was on the line or you were in a good contested battle, because field position can be very important in those contests. You want to be able to flip the field, as they say, or take advantage of getting a turnover and not being able to move the ball and get that field goal at 42 yards or 45 yards or 47 yards, whatever the case may be, which was not necessarily a given with this particular quarterback playing kicker. I think overall, I would recommend, if you do this, to do it at the lower levels, simply because those core attributes will tend to balance or normalize, if you will, and provide you with a quarterback who is a little more on par with what would be considered a normal D2 kicker or a normal D2 punter. The advantage, overall is that it does give you one more roster position if you usually use either a kicker or a punter, and more so if you're accustomed to using both a kicker and a punter. So now you've freed up 2 roster positions. Those can be very valuable when you're looking at having a specialized offense where you want to load up on running backs in order to have, 3 or 4 players in the same year, and you're going to run the ball down your opponent's throat. That's difficult to accomplish year in and year out when you've got a running back who's a senior, another one who's a junior, another one who's a sophomore. You're carrying 4 or 5 running backs. Your depth is not really going to be there. And each year, your primary numero uno running back is going to have about the same caliber of ability because he's moving up the ranks each year, so that by the time he's a senior, he's a valuable starter for you. But again, that depth is not necessarily there. The other thing too is being able to have multiple running backs in that situation that are in the same class, that allows you to keep them on the field, and swap them out every play or every other play, keep them really fresh, more so than normal. And maybe not so much at the beginning of a quarter or at the half, toward the end of that particular quarter, or toward the end of that half, toward the end of that series, especially if it's a long drive and that defense has been on the field a bit. That defense is going to swap out to some lesser quality players, and you're still, swapping in your number 1 and number 2 running back who are fresh essentially. And that will give you some huge advantages that you won't necessarily see at the start of the quarter. But as the game progresses, you'll notice that is going to make a difference if your opponent does not have the depth to match the depth that you have at that running back position. Also, if you're using a passing game instead, those 2 extra positions could be used for your wide receivers. And you could do the same thing we just went through with running backs as wide receivers by adding to that depth. Or you can actually increase your opportunity by having those receiving running backs. You're recruiting running backs who are going to be primarily receivers for you, so that now you can flood the field by having 2 running backs that are possession backs, along with, let's say you're running a pro set, along with 2 good quality wide receivers. You really give the defense some fits when you've got 4 quality players out there that can catch the ball. And if you happen to be lucky enough to work yourself into a position where you've got a tight end that's fast and he's got great hands, and now you're using him in the passing game as well, that can really affect a defense's ability to stop that offensive attack, especially if you structure that attack so that you're focusing on wide receivers one play, and the next play you've got essentially the same personnel on the field, just filled by different players. And now you focus on running backs. For instance, you've got running back Johnson and Jones, who are just your freshmen out there getting playing time with no intention of targeting them, but they're still in the pattern. They're still occupying a defender. They're still making a defender work, but your principal targets are your wide receivers. You've got your wide receiver black and your wide receiver white. So you run those guys out there targeting your wide receivers, and the next play you flip it. Black and white come out of the game, and Johnson and Jones or whoever comes out of the game, and you put your pass receiving running backs in and your freshman wide receiver who is just occupying space, and now you're targeting your running backs. So you can use that to your advantage, especially with that depth or the flexibility by having receiving running backs on your roster. That those additional roster spots can turn in to be valuable for you if you're going to do an offensive setup like that. But again, you may forego some field position. You may forego some field goal opportunities. But as a coach once told me, he said, we never try field goals, because if we're really good as we think we are, we shouldn't rely on the field goal. We should be getting 6 every offensive series. So it'd be nice. So far, I haven't been able to make that happen here in GD or in real life for that matter. But the big thing is you by foregoing those 2 positions, kicker and punter, and filling those with position players effectively on offense, really opens up the opportunities for you to do some things that you normally wouldn't be able to do. Another way you can do that is kind of what Katzfang did with his position recruiting, intentionally, overlooking some positions and filling some heavily. You could almost do the same thing if you're going to, let's say, run a trips formation. The experiment would be to just get, run-of-the-mill tight ends and run-of-the-mill running backs, just onesies, twosies, maybe 3 on the roster each year, and really fill your wide receiver room with good quality wide receivers, so that you've got 3 and possibly 4 in a class each year. And that is your target. Then, you're throwing to those guys, you're keeping them fresh. And again, you're able to have that depth of quality players that the defense can't naturally match up with. So the experimentation allows you to configure your roster in that way, shape, and form, and try the different things. Now, you must also understand that one quarter, one half, one game, hell, for that matter, one season may not be enough data to really provide you with substantial information to make a long-term decision on how you want to handle your setup, especially if you're looking at a situation where you're just doing this and it is year one. So your roster isn't really structured to how you want it to be in 3 or 4 years down the road. Your formation IQ isn't necessarily there if you're trying a new formation with this. So those are the things that you really have to consider before you make a decision that yes, this works, or no, this doesn't work. It's always easy to say yes, it's working if you're having successful seasons, deep playoff runs, etc. But to be able to get you over the top into that national championship game and win that national championship, I'd venture to say you're not going to be able to just arbitrarily throw up an experiment and make that very successful your first year. So give yourself some time, be patient, run the system, I would say at least one season, and then go back and look at your games that you played and see, if the tweaks you made throughout that year were successful. And one of the things that's really key when you do that, or any experiment of this nature, take notes. Oh my gosh, the notebook is your friend. Print out the box score from that particular game or each successive game. Make your notes for that game so that you can look back and know exactly who you played, when, where, and why. Make notes regarding the substitution rate. Keep a log of minutes on how many minutes you had targeted for each player to get and how many they actually received based on their game log and the adjustments you made to kind of get the results that you were expecting. So it's really important to keep those notes because, as was my case, the season was over and now I was guessing myself and trying to remember, did I do this game, or was this the game where I intentionally had the substitution rate real low to keep so-and-so in the game longer? And, those are the kind of questions you don't want to be asking yourself at the end of a season or at the end of your experiment, because that's the whole purpose of the experiment, is to collect the data to enable you to determine if your experiment is in fact something that you want to keep and go forward with. But I would definitely, if you're going to do that, I would definitely use, probably 2 or 3 seasons to get the show on the road and make things happen. And again, at the very beginning, I mentioned I did this in a particular world, and I believe it was camp. And it's not so much worrying about my coach's record, overall career record, or whatever the case may be, as it was that I knew that this world was my experimentation world. All the others I ran how I chose to run them for the months and years before that, or whatever changes I was making as required based on the opponent. But when it came to the experimentation factor, I did not do that in those other worlds, simply because I could not commit to the long-term season or 2 or 3 seasons that would be required in order to get that data. Now, some may say, well, if you did it instead of using one team, if you just did it using 3 or 4 teams across 3 or 4 worlds, or even more, you would have a lot more data. Well, that is true in some sense, but the reality is no 2 teams are alike. They don't have the same caliber players. They don't have the necessary opponents that are exactly equal each week. So all of those different factors would make tracking that stuff, even with heavy note taking, extremely difficult. And maybe that's what it takes to have the upper level success that you see some of these other coaches have. Or, you actually decide to just, throw caution to the wind. And for the next 3 or 4 real world months, all I'm going to do is experiment with all my teams that I have in Gridiron Dynasty. And based on the information that those games reveal, whether what you're doing is successful or not. But, that's a huge commitment when you're talking about just giving up everything you've been working for at this point and just say, we're hitting the pause button here and doing some across the world's experimentation for the next couple of months. But some of the other things that was mentioned on the board was having no wide receivers draft. Or I keep saying drafted. I've been dealing with the NFL draft and fantasy sports, so draft is on my mind. Forgive me. Having recruited no wide receivers. In some cases, tight ends will fill in. The program will throw a tight end in there, or other cases it'll throw a running back in there. So it all depends on who's available, who's next in the pecking order. The computer or the program makes those decisions and gets those players in the game. Or you could be, real extreme like Cat's Fang and just not recruit wide receivers and running backs and rely on your tight ends. You know who's going to be in the game that way. The other one, of course, that I mentioned many times ago is the experiment of using a quarterback as a kicker or punter. That's a different kind of experiment in regards to what we were talking about just a bit ago. This experiment allowed me to realize that that's a viable solution to an issue if, a kicker or punter wasn't available for the price I was willing to pay. And that's always the key thing. You can pretty much get any player out there that you can recruit that's in your vision. But are you willing to spend the money and break the bank to do that? And many, many more times than not, the answer is no. So, I try to stay away from battles when it comes to kickers and punters. Too often you can find a quarterback who has the good strength and good technique to where he will do an admirable job at a kicker or punter position. Now, that first year, I will say this, that first year, it may be a bit of a frustration effort, simply because the punts may not be as far as you want them to be, or the field goal range may not be as far as you want it to be. But the fact that one player, that one quarterback who you have changed position into either a punter or a kicker is now doing not just his duty as a kicker or punter, he's doing both. So, as a quarterback that you changed into the kicker position, he's expecting to get, excuse me, got a frog in my throat. He's expecting to get 100% of the kicking opportunities. And since he's more than likely, hopefully, the only position player or the only player in those positions that are doing kicking and punting, he's going to get 100% of those kicking duties, which results in his work ethic going up quite a bit. Now, you couple that with the fact he's also doing punting duties, and now this player who was expecting to just get a couple plays a game is getting many plays a game because now he's a punter as well. His work ethic goes through the roof. And as his work ethic increases, given that he's an average or better player when it comes to potential, his values are going to go up, and he's going to become a much more effective kicker for you. Now, this is an experiment that I'm actually undertaking, and it's based on what I just said, and some of you may have caught it, but I'll explain to those that may have not caught it, and that is this. As a kicker, who knows how many kicking opportunities you're going to get in a game? And, we're talking kickoffs, we're talking field goals. And if your kicker is expecting to kick the ball off 2 or 3 times a game and attempt 2 or 3 field goals a game, he has an opportunity to be on the field maybe 6, 7 times that entire game. And if that's his expectation, based on how the program is coded, if he's getting on the field 6 or 7 times a game, then he's going to be very satisfied. His work ethic is going to go up. Now, that is as a kicker. Now, theoretically, as a punter on a bad team or a bad offensive team, he's going to see the field a lot more than a punter on a very good offensive team. Because one, a good offensive team is expected to be able to establish drives and take the ball down the field. And if they do, they generally end up in field goal range at the least. So your punter may only see the game or may only be on the field 2 or 3 times. And if that's been kind of his expectation, yeah, okay, he's seeing, he's on the field as many times as he expects to be, which is fine. But now what I'm looking at doing is putting a kicker on a team like the first year you take a team over. And, it's pretty horrible unless you've taken the cream of the crop team. If you're starting off with a historically sim team or whatever the case may be, you have no kicker and no punter on that team based on the cuts you've made, etc. You have an opportunity to recognize your offense is not going to be all that good initially, the first year or two at least. That being the case, you're probably going to be doing a lot of punting. So as a punter position, that punter would expect to see, and I don't know how the coding works, but it's just my mind thinking that they have some idea of what's going on, would expect to see the field, more than just 2 or 3 times a game. So the expectation would be that he sees it maybe 5 or 6 times a game, 7 times a game, whatever the case may be. But a kicker, on the other hand, on a bad offensive team is going to know, one, we're not scoring touchdowns, so I'm not doing kickoffs. I may do 1 a game. And field goal range may simply be because we got a turnover on that end of the field, and boom, we're in field goal range instead of having established a drive with this poor offensive team. So your kicker may only be expected to get on the field once, twice, maybe 3 times a game. And again, I don't know how the coding works, but this is just kind of the thinking that I'm putting out there. So in that case of having a year 1 team with a expected poor offense, I would change a quarterback to a kicker, because again, he's only expecting to be on the field 2 or 3 times a game roughly. And since you have a bad offense, you're going to be doing a lot more punting. So those 2 or 3 times on the field that the kicker is expected to be out there has now possibly even tripled, because he's punting the ball 6, 7 times a game. So in addition to those 3 opportunities as a kicker, he's now getting, 7 or 8 additional plays as a punter. So his work ethic is going to shoot through the roof, so that by the time he's a junior or senior, his work ethic is probably going to be 100. And I've seen it many times where my punter or kicker has been 100. He's just maxed out in no time. His work ethic, and he continues to improve just because he's getting 200% playing time. He's getting all the playing time that's expected of a kicker and all the playing time that's expected of a punter. So now, years down the road, you've got a pretty good offense, and you're driving in, you're getting a lot of field goals, you're getting a lot of touchdowns. So now your kicker is on the field a lot more than your punter, because you're not punting the ball away. So it's at this point in that transition to where maybe that kicker has graduated to where now I would convert a quarterback to a punter if a really good punter wasn't available, simply because now the punter is expecting to be on the field 3 or 4 times. And the reality is, you're kicking off 6 times a game because you're scoring that many touchdowns, and you may be getting 3 or 4 field goal attempts a game. So now the inverse, as I mentioned, is true. That punter, his perceived playing time has tripled. So again, his work ethic shoots through the roof, and he continues to grow all the way up through his senior year, of course, with a greater work ethic value than he normally would have otherwise. So that is what I've seen in the past with the punter and kicker position. But the one thing I'm going to look at closely is the concept of having a kicker on a poor offensive team and then converting a quarterback or adding a punter to a team that has a good offensive team to substantiate my hypothesis that in that setup, those players will evolve with their work ethic a lot faster than normal. If, for instance, if you had a kicker on a good offensive team or a punter on a bad offensive team, you know, he's getting what he expects essentially. So that was a long way to go to say that I've got some experimentation under my belt that I'm going to do. That's kind of the advance of my experiment of converting a quarterback to a punter or a kicker, which is successful. Especially when you consider the money you save by not battling for a kicker or a punter can be used in other battles or in other opportunities to get those recruits on board on your team. Now, that's not to say I intentionally overlook recruiting a punter or kicker. That's not what I'm saying. The whole premise is that a punter or kicker is not available to me at the price I'm willing to pay. You know, it may be a good punter out there that he may have 3 sims on him, and I know I've got a battle, and he's 500 miles away, or he's just inside my 360. That's still an expensive allotment of recruiting budget for a punter or kicker that can possibly be, that money can be saved by going after and recruiting a quarterback who is lower on the quarterback ranking chart as a quarterback, but his attributes as a kicker or a punter are there to make him a viable candidate to fill one of those 2 positions. Now, the other hidden gem in all this is when you intentionally recruit a quarterback for a punter or kicker position, you know you're going to change him. Always, always, always offer him a freshman start and 75% playing time. Because again, remember, he's going to be fulfilling 2 positions. So he's going to have 75% playing time probably at the end of the first half. So playing time will not be an issue in that regard because he will be on the field as both a punter and a kicker. So offering him freshman start, getting him the maximum playing time, especially if he's an undecided, you know, you could probably get him without promising those, but those are definitely clinchers. You know, after you've sent the head coaching or the assistant coach scouting report, if he's not green for you, then those are some things that you can do to get him on board. And like I said, save yourself some money. Allow yourself to get another position player that will really help either your defense or your offense. But anyway, that's kind of been my foray into that particular pork. And that's what we used to call it years ago, punter or kicker, the old pork. You'd see that on the forums quite a bit. And like I said, it's been very successful. So for those of you who find yourself without a punter or kicker, I encourage you to try that. Convert one of those quarterbacks to that position. If you're out there and you're wanting to do an experiment where you're recruiting all linebackers and not recruiting defensive linemen and DBs, and you want to see how that works out, you know, run it for a year or so, take many notes, and if you're willing to share, you know, put it on the board or site mail me, and we'll chat about it and get you on the show, and so you can explain what you've done. Because one of the things that I really enjoy is being able to share a nugget of wisdom and seeing that someone else has picked that up and it's worked for them as equal or better than it's worked for me. So by sharing that information and being available to answer questions of others when it comes to your specific experiment could be very helpful to the community as a whole. And even more so, it could be helpful to you because let's say today you decided that you were going to try to recruit nothing but tight ends and quarterbacks, and you weren't going to recruit a running back or a wide receiver, and you were just starting off. Well, Cat's Fang has already done that for a bit, so there's somebody that you could, you know, chat with and get some insight. and maybe save yourself some headache or money or lost opportunities by getting some of the information that he has available. So don't be afraid to share. Get on the message board, on the forums as they're called, and just reach out to others, or just like Sir Biff did. Hey, has anybody ever done an experiment? And what'd you do? And what were the results? A lot of good information will come your way simply by being open and ask. Don't be too shy. This is a game that we all love, a game that we all play. And while some coaching records will say otherwise, nobody's perfect. There's some coaches out there who've got some damn near perfect coaching records, but everybody has an opportunity to succeed in this game. But one of the first steps is, read as much about the game as you can that's presented in the forums, that's presented as information from the game itself, or even some of the tutorials that are on the forums. And definitely reach out and speak with people about what they've done, what they found that works, or what doesn't, especially when you're looking at an opportunity with a really good team to take it to that next level, to improve it in one particular area. You don't want to try to bite off too much and improve your offense and defense. I mean, that's just going to be a headache for you. It's going to be frustrating, and more times than not. Work on a specific side of the ball. Work on your defense. Maybe for this 6, 7, 8 games, you're looking at linebacker stuff, or maybe for this season you're working with linebackers, or for the next 3 or 4 seasons you're just looking at linebacker opportunities, and expand it the following to maybe DBs or defensive linemen. But don't be afraid to experiment. I've said that since day one. And sometimes you discover a little nugget that you would not have even thought of had you not just rolled the dice and say, hey, I wonder what happens if I do this. And you'd be surprised some of the information that comes your way when you address that stuff on the board. So we're going to wrap the show up. I know it's going to be a little short show for this Thursday, but hopefully you've learned a little bit of something. And if any of this from this particular show brings questions to you, don't hesitate to site mail me. I'll get into the weeds a little deeper with you and go over some of the nuances of some of the things that I've discussed. And if you've got countering opinions or realizations or experiences, again, I welcome those. We all learn when we get as many different opinions and experiences to help us out and get a better picture of what's actually going on. So anyway, just wanted to say thank you for joining and listening and tuning in, and hope to see you again on the next show. I'm your host, Magic, and this has been another episode of This, That, and the Other. I'm supposed to be playing the outro.